Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series of India Energy Transition Dialogues. As many of you participated in the last three webinars, we discussed on distributed energy resources, solar agriculture feeders, and the last session was around viability of utilities and what sort of innovations we need to make the utilities viable. And in this fourth session, we are going to discuss data gaps and in energy sector, how it affects our planning for energy future, and what can you do as a community to address this data gap. So over last 10 years, there has been significant improvements in data availability in power sector as well as the broader energy sector. We have a range of portals, scheme-specific portals by various agencies, and also think tanks in recent years, which are providing a substantial amount of data. But then we still have information gap, and planning for the ongoing energy transition requires much more granular data, higher standards, and consistency in reporting and accessibility to modelers, to general public, everyone. So the question is how to improve reliability and usability of available data in the sector, and what sort of details and standards are required to plan better for the future, where India has a 450 gigawatt RE target. So integrating that over next 9 years is a big task, and for that we need greater level of planning. So today we have a stellar panel to discuss this issue and provide their insights. So we have Mr. Sushil Kumar Suni, who headed POSOCO for several years, and he currently acts as an advisor to POSOCO. So he brings in a rich expertise on power system operation. And then we have Mr. Arijit Basu, who was a managing director at State Bank of India Group, and he was key for infrastructure financing, including power sector projects. And he brings in that rich expertise from the financing sector. We have Urmi Goswami, who is a senior reporter with uh, Economic Times. He has reported the sector for several years and provided us information in the early days and now also. So we have Thomas Spencer, who is an analyst at the International Energy Agency, and in his past role also at KP, he has been one of the leading modelers on Indian power sector and energy sector as well. So he brings in that rich expertise. Then we have Mr. Srinivas Krishnaswamy, who is CEO of Vasudha Foundation, and Brinda Sarda from Vasudha Foundation, who has recently put up a portal called Vasudha Power Info Hub, which provides some of this data at accessible level. So we'll start the webinar with an introductory presentation by Srinivas and Brinda, and then follow up with a discussion. So without much delay, I hand over to Srini and Brinda for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashwini, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I'm Srinivas Krishnaswamy, CEO of Vasudha Foundation. This presentation on showcasing the data portal for the power sector developed by us in order to set the context for today's discussion will be done in two parts. I will start off by giving a broad picture of the genesis of the work and the data portal and what set us to undertake this exercise, followed by my colleague Brinda, who will take you through the salient features of the data portal in its current form, the challenges we faced in compiling and collating data and putting together this website, and also share some insights on some of the future additions in progress on the data portal. The idea is to have a very comprehensive data portal. Now, going backwards, stepping backwards, the initial seeds for creating a comprehensive data portal was sown way back in 2015-16. And despite the fact that at that point in time, we did not have any funding for this work, we started by creating what is today popularly known as a wireframe, by putting together a broad framework of what is the kind of data that we would be putting together and that we believe would be very useful for easy access to all. So, and initially we focused largely on the generation side, and again with a very specific focus on both functional and pipeline coal-fired power plant to start off with. However, with support from SET Fund and then later on from SIF, the Children Investment Fund Foundation, we were able to expand this. And then I'm not going to get into further details. Brinda will throw light on some of those aspects. Now, a little bit on the rationale as to why we felt that this website was required. Yes, Brinda, the second slide, please. Yeah, and this sort of links to the attributes of high quality data and clean energy transition. So the reason for conceiving this project was largely due to the fact that data availability and accessibility at that particular point in time was a major issue. Things have improved though over time with multiple dashboards and portals, though of course a lot of them do give a lot of information, but mainly high level information. And so that comes to the second aspect that we faced was the granularity of information, which a lot of portals still do not have. The third one that we felt at that particular point of time when we conceived this portal was the absence of completeness of data. When we say completeness of data, basically we refer to mapping of cross-sectoral issues, linking the power sector with land use, power sector with water availability, air quality issue, forest cover, biodiversity, etc. The works. So we felt that having a completeness of information would also help in better analysis and assessment of the power sector. The third was absence of relevance of data. When I say relevance of data, again, there are two aspects to it. One is the timely availability of data. That is data with very little or no time lag, or in other words, you'd say real-time data. And more is that when I say timely, it also refers to the information that's particularly available on new pipeline plans and so on and so forth. So that also was something that was lacking, and that was another reason why we thought that those aspects need to be covered. And fourthly, I did talk about the granularity of the data. And then, of course, one other issue that we also felt was the consistency of data to the extent possible. Again, given that multiple portals give multiple different numbers for the same issue, how does one sort of reconcile with this consistency of data? And these we realized were also attributes for high quality data, particularly from a clean energy transition perspective, that this slide sort of very articulately or very clearly explains when we talk of the completeness, available, accessibility, reliable and accurate data, granularity of data, and the relevance of data. That would help in forecasting, prediction, control and monitoring for new load profiles. Look at the issue of prosumers, which is again the new concept, uptake of electric vehicles, distributed energy resources, storage and new technologies, complexities of the grid, and all of this adding to the new or leading to a clean energy transition, and of course, the whole aspect of net zero. Next slide, please. So keeping in time this wireframe, that's how, I mean, when we, this sort of slide gives explanation as to some of the examples on what we mean by granularity, something that I already spoke of, availability and accessibility and these issues. But I would just, before I hand over the floor to Brinda, I just wanted to add another point that keeping this in mind, next slide, please. The website framework, so to speak, evolved, and what we believe and hope would be a comprehensive data portal that would provide easy access to data for all, not hidden behind any paywalls, because one thing that we realize that while there are a lot of publications that do give out data, a lot of them are paid data, and sometimes the charges are fairly steep, and not all can afford it. Act as a single source window of information. This is largely because you do have multiple, like I said, you do have multiple dashboards and web portals, but one will have to browse through multiple dashboards and web portal to get that information. What we felt that a single source window or a single source data portal that would reduce the hassle of browsing through multiple dashboards and web portals is something that is required. Act as a tracker of India's NDC implementation, and this is something that is live on the website, and be updated on a frequent basis, sometimes even on a daily or a weekly basis, depending on as and when the information flow is there. And then, like I said, provide granular data. Since a lot of dashboards and web portals tend to focus on high-level data, we felt that access to granular data would also be important. And again, in order to sort of arrive at trends, we also, the data portal, we decided would also delve into historical data, from historical data to current data, in order to assist policymakers, investors, and others to get a better understanding of the trends and the trends so far. I will now hand over the floor to Brinda to take you through the salient features of the website. Over to you, Brinda.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Shani. So, just not taking a lot of everyone's time, I'll quickly try to summarize. So basically, the Vasudha Power Info Hub was launched in February, and we have been working since 2018 to conceptualize this website, and it aims to meet those twin objectives where we are looking at granular aggregated data for researchers, modelers, economists, etc. And at the same time, providing those high level and a quick glance of the entire sector and the states for our policymakers, financial community, etc., banks, etc. So some of the salient features, if I have to go through. So it's a free and easy to download website. It is free of cost, does not require any credentials. There is an NDC tracker. The portal tracks the progress of India's NTCs by providing the various targets and its achievements for 2022, 2027, 2030, source-wise. Another interesting feature that the portal looks at, the InfoHub looks at, is the cross-sectoral linkages, where we are trying to map different elements beyond the power sector in terms of water availability, land requirement, air quality, environment, and socio-economic aspects like per capita electricity consumption, to present a comprehensive picture of the power sector. Then for our second load, in terms of, we are looking at some quick analytics where we are comparing the states across parameters which are as broad and basic, to just provide a quick understanding in terms of what has been the RE capacity installed over the years, which state has done the fastest, what is the thermal generation, RE generation share looks like at every state, at India level, etc. Another interesting feature that we added to enhance the analysis part was the briefing papers, where we had come out with 3 briefing papers as of now, one being the power versus pandemic, another one being where we had looked out the detailed analysis of forced outages in the country, and we've been able to find out that in the last, for the units, coal-fired power plants from 1960 to 2009, there has been a large number of forced outages because of the technical plant-wise reasons, as well as low demand, low schedule and low demand from the distribution sector. Then another feature, then the third briefing paper also looks at peak demand as well as installed capacity gaps and varying them across different scenarios, and per capita electricity consumption and looking at its status. Another feature which we have added is the interactive infographics, which I'm going to take you through in the next few slides. A deep dive ad. So right now there is the phase 1 of the project, which looks at electricity, based most of the information at the electricity generation level for all sources, and highlights the growing contribution of renewable power in India. It looks at the daily, monthly, annual generation data, and almost all of them provided at the plant level, most of them having all discom-wise data and then again aggregated at the state level. We have a detailed plant-wise page for coal, gas, and hydro, where we are looking at providing all the information of all these power plants in terms of its PLF, capacity sizes, auxiliary consumptions, the land requirement, and other different technical and operational details. Then looking at RE generation and capacities at the state level from 2015 onwards. There is a very ready map of graph available and their trajectories for all the power sources, the generation tariff trajectories. And then there is another map of India which gives a ready breakup of operational, pipeline, retired, and shelf generation capacities for all sources. And as I mentioned before, we have detailed plant-wise data on forced outages for coal power plants, and also its analysis available in the form of briefing paper. So these are just some quick snapshots. If you see here, these are how many units of coal power plants are working, how many of them have been shelved over the years. And then below this, details on each of those power plants are provided in ready available formats, Excel formats. Then this is the state-wise electricity consumption data, which we have tried to map versus the design versus operating heat rate. If you look at this, I'm not going to take you through the website though, but these are just quick snapshots on where we are looking at multiple sectors and mapping it with the power sector. This is a ready glance, map available where we can quickly find out what is the operational capacities of different power plants, the pipeline data, the shelf data, the retired data. And this interesting map looks at how each discom is procuring power from various states and how what is the source-wise contribution in power procurement for each discom across the country over the years. Some of the snapshots of the infographics where we are looking at providing a very quick numbers for tariff trends, installed capacity. We are looking at making some of these more of these snapshots. Okay, I'll just quickly press it. Yeah. The phase 2 of the project is looking at to become a one-stop portal for all the India energy, climate, and relevant economic data. In that, we will continue to update the existing database on the generation side, on the supply side by adding more information on the transmission progress, renewable energy resource potentials, decentralized RE, etc. Another important feature that we are now going to working towards adding on the website is making it a completely comprehensive website to capture all the value across the chain on the demand side, mostly at the consumer level for all states, and then addition of technical and financial data of all electricity distribution utilities in ready available formats. We also feel that to meet the target, our climate targets and energy targets, it's important to also track the progress of all the states and hence creating a state deep dive section of all of the entire power sector at one place. And most importantly, the main important point of the website is to make it a user-friendly and a dynamic website for easy data access and availability of all the data on the power energy sector. While we have been on this process for almost 3 years into the making, we have also experienced a large number of different kinds of data-related challenges, which we tried to categorize. So one challenges which I'll just take you quickly through some of these challenges, which is first one on the data inconsistency of where we have seen sudden spike in a generation power plant when it has not been giving out any of the when it has not been showing any generation for the past few months and there's a sudden spike for a particular month, or the opposite of it, that whether it has been generating and there's sudden no values around it. Then there is different nomenclature and granularity issues. So, and this has been more on the demand side where we're facing that multiple methodologies are being used for calculation of losses, efficiencies, cost numbers by various states. Then there is a large dearth of non-availability of granular consumption data by different consumer categories. On the data formats, I think this has been for all the energy sector professionals and researchers on the data formats where we have time and again faced issues around PDF. There are scanned documents available, PDF documents, which are sometimes not even clear. Multiple tariff order formats are there across states, which leads to difficulties in comprehensively understanding the data together across the country, across states, then the data scrubbing and cleaning issues. The fourth point on the relevance, we have seen that there has been lot of times there have been a time lag across various sites in terms of publishing its monthly or yearly reports. Data accessibility. So recently what we are facing is that we've seen that on the PPAs, while they are available, but there is a very hit and trial method needed to get those PPAs available. So, and they're not available on their respective state websites. And while there's a lot amount of good data available in the generation sector, there is a need for easy accessibility of minute, hourly level generation data. An interesting challenge, I don't know whether to call it interesting, what we've been facing is that there has been there is a different data for similar parameters. So RTI data sometimes varies for the same duration, varies with the actual published data. And then sometimes there are times that the daily values don't really add up to the monthly data. So these are the quick snapshot of, yeah. So here is basically I'll just take 1 minute where if you see here the under construction power plants, one place it shows as under construction, while it is on the other place, it shows it acts as an operational unit. Then the capacity in the monthly sheet sometimes don't add up in the installed India capacity sheet. Okay. Yeah, so these are some of the other numbers where we see abruptly high value of generation. Yeah. Thank you. This is all from my side. And I'll now hand over to Srini in case there are any additional comments.
Not really. Maybe later, if people have questions, we'll be able to. We'll be happy to answer it. Over to you, Ashwini.
Yeah, thanks, Srini and Brinda for the presentation and taking us through the portal, interesting portal, and pointing out the challenges in data. We'll now take a round of initial remarks from the panelists. So I'll request Mr. Soni to go first. You are on mute, sir.
Yeah. This is what happens actually. Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Actually, I don't know whether I am the right person to be in this panel. I feel that I am a very naive as far as the field of data is concerned, having worked for 4 decades in power system. We live with data. We generate data. We visualize the system through data. And more the data I have received, while there are many end users of data, who are the generators of data? Who generates the data? Let's try to understand that. What is measured and what is not measured? That's very important. Measured data, its accuracy, precision, granularity, all are issues. We, with technology change, are now getting data in milliseconds. 40 milliseconds you get data. But processing of that data itself is a subject. Let me jump from here to there. First of all, who is interested in data? Not anyone. Everybody wants information. That information is basically processed data. Then you want not only information, you want knowledge out of that data, and finally the wisdom. And value addition of data is the real issue. Raw data is raw, and those who process this data really know the pains of the data. Now, data cleaning is a subject by itself, huge challenge. Now, I heard that there are spikes There is a term called live zero, dead zero. When suddenly the value starts dropping because of the communication failure, because of the measurement error. Signals are never clean, never pure signals. While I am talking, there is a lot of noise. One has to filter out noise. So there are lots of issues with data, and the end user must understand how the data comes to them and what are the process which goes on. Visualization is a full subject by itself. I'll not talk about that. But let me first say the two ends of the spectrum. On one hand, we have RTI, and on the other hand, we have privacy. And one has to take care of both, and it's changing with time. So there are data which are offline. There are data which are online. There are thick data. Then abuse of data. We must remember that everybody is not angel, and then we have data privacy issues. Asymmetry is another part of it, and data disclosure. What is to be disclosed and what is not to be disclosed. Own indemnification of data. Who is the data controller? The transparency, the platforms, data warehouse, data retrieval, each is a subject. And I would say that there are two documents available in public domain at present. One is of DST, I think that's on a National Data Sharing and Accessibility Policy. It makes a very nice document. It's a very bulky document, but worth reading. And the second one is 2017 vintage Métis white paper on data protection in India. So I would suggest that, if one have a look at these, the maturity will come as to what exactly is this whole field of data about. And talking about completeness of data, I think it's an utopia. It will be never complete. As the technology will improve, as we will grow, we will need more and more and more and more data. Now come to power sector straight. Power sector, as per Act, who has the responsibility of keeping the data and disseminating the data? It is the CEA. CEA has the responsibility of data dissemination, data collection, and by law they can demand for data. And CEA made a regulation also. That was way back in 2007. That's also available in public domain. It has 65 formats of different kind of data, which is to be made available to them. And they make all this data available. But that is of 2007 vintage. And at that time, the technology, half-life of technology, how it has changed, we all know about it. I can, just quickly read out those, but it's not worth. You can have a look at it because it has data of generation, transmission, distribution, trading, energy efficiency, statistics, and all kinds of data which could have been thought. There was a consultant who framed all these things, and that was of 2007. Now, the issue is that all these things need revision. We need comprehensive regulation, which should say who has the data, how much of it will be put up on public domain, also say not be put on the public domain. And in the what has happened in the last 15 years, every regulation which CRC makes, it has a provision of what would be made public. And accordingly, those data are made public on the websites of the load dispatch centers or the traders or the utilities. There is a huge list of all those regulations. They have come in stages, and each has its own provision about the data, starting from grid code to open access to trading to
congestion and transmission charge sharing, deviation settlement. You name any regulation and there would be data. Now, let me say 3 basic buckets in which the data is to be put. One is open access, another is restricted, and third is confidential. And data very quickly takes a very ugly turn and turns out to be a security issues. Every day we hear how there has been a compromise of data. So one has to also equally worry about that. And list, believe me, if we keep making it, every time you make a list, you are yourself never satisfied, because by the time you have made the list, you are changed. You now feel there should be something else. As far as analytics is concerned, and the way the formats are, the technology itself is changing so fast. The formats which we used a couple of years back have now become obsolete. So everything has to be transported from one platform to another platform, and that's quite a job. So I will not take much time. I mean, I would only say that one needs clear policy. One needs regulation exclusively on data, at least in the power sector. What is to be put in public domain, what granularity, what format, what is not to be put, and all such things should be there. But that would also not suffice. You need to provide resources to the utility. There has to be data scientists. The people with those kind of designations have to be there in the utility, and they have to be provided with resources. There has to be a budget for data, and it can't be a side job of just putting some data on public domain, which is hitherto happening. And the end user side also, people should not expect everything ready-made data. Just to give last, I will stop from after that. Let's say the demand of India, how it is calculated. There's nothing called a meter where you just measure and you say that this is the demand. I can't measure your hunger. I can measure how much you ate at what time. But demand of India is basically a culmination of at least 100,000 data. We get 100,000 data generation from every source, where the flow is how much, and all those have to be aggregated, and then demand is calculated. There is nothing called a demand meter. So there are nuances to how the values are calculated. One has to respect all these aspects if you are an end user of data. That's where I will stop, and then I'll again come back if required. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sunil. That's pretty useful. I'll now request Mr. Basu to provide his initial remarks.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Swain. Good afternoon to all. And thanks to Mr. Krishnaswamy and the CPR for inviting me here. I'll start with how I got in touch with Vasudha Foundation and Mr. Krishnaswamy, and how interesting it looked to me. This was about 2.5 years ago, when he came forward saying that pro bono, we are doing some work for the power sector and for various other infrastructure sectors, which banks could also use. So in fact, I was very skeptical. I said, is it really something which you are doing? Because you have these consultancy firms, etc., who come forward, who also compile data. And first of all, I'd like to begin today by saying this is really wonderful work. And as my previous speaker said, this is a very a field which is rife with possibilities, and yet the challenges are immense. That is how I would put it. So before I come to the power sector and speak a little more about that, just one illustration to cite the importance of data. Today, I think the example which will probably resonate most with us is what is happening in the pandemic. And at one point of time, last year, even wherever I got some time free from the bank, I would try and look at the websites of the various health departments or state governments who were putting out various data relating to how the pandemic was progressing and how it was being addressed. And without naming the states, etc., there was a very high correlation between the manner in which the data was being presented, the transparency, the obvious transparency or lack of transparency which was evident when this data was being put out, and the ability of those state governments to manage the COVID at various points in time. I will not go beyond this. Just why I made this point is, in data, what is important is not just how you are putting it out, what you are putting out, but I think it starts with your willingness to put out data. So, why should someone not be willing to be transparent? Because, if you have data which will be beneficial to all, even in the power sector. So I know what is my, the examples which were given when Vasudha was making the presentation on what is the PLF, what is the progress report of the project, etc., etc. The more the data, the more the transparency evident in the data, the better it is for all the stakeholders. And from the financial sector, I can say from the bank's perspective, why I found the work that Vasudha is attempting to do, and very clearly they have achieved a lot, but there is a lot more scope for improvement, and at the same time they also need the environment to become better for them, in the sense that as rightly pointed out, state governments, the power plants, the central government has to become more cohesive and more transparent in giving data. So from a banker's perspective, when we look at projects at 4 or 5 stages. So the first stage is at the conception stage itself. People conceive a project and approach a bank right at that stage. Now, unless and until we know the entire sectoral composition, how we are placed in terms of, so if it is, say, an existing power plant. So of course, Vasudha's focus is on renewable energy. But even if it is renewable energy, or even if it is a NTPC coming forward with some addition to their coal-based capacity, we need to know how this fits into the overall perspective that India has given. And in the movement, we are at so many gigawatts for renewable, we will move to so many gigawatts. Is it fitting in? And the second thing which personally interested me, and point was made in the presentation, was on the cross-sectoral linkages. So when you are conceiving, it's just not what is going to happen, what will be the demand for your power plant and things like that. When you are executing the project, will the land acquisition happen on time? And Mr. Krishnaswamy, I remember, had spent some time explaining to us how they are working on that. Will the land acquisition happen on time? What are the other factors that need to fall in place? Just to give you a sense, State Bank being one of the largest project lenders, we've had a system, I think now for more than 10 to 15 years, of having sector specialists for each of the sectors that we finance. So we finance, say, 35 infrastructure sectors, and even within them divisions. So power sector will have a sector specialist for wind, sector specialist for solar. But then, and these are all eminent people. They would have been the topmost person in a wind energy company, or an engineer who has had years of experience. But even for them, when we interacted with them, they would be able to give their wise opinion only when they are able to access high quality data. And there are some companies which do that. But what I think Vasudha attempts to do, and Vasudha and many others need to continue to do that, is to be able to bring about that coordination, which will give us a 360-degree view when we take decisions right at the outset. So 111 lakh crore or something like that is the pipeline. So I was also involved in this. So there was a subcommittee set up, which I was chairing last year, on how we will accomplish this. What are the enablers that need to be done? And one of the recommendations that we had given in this group on project finance was that we need access to high quality data, not only bankers, but the entire ecosystem. The second stage, so suppose you are able to go over the first stage of choosing the right candidate for financing. And if you don't choose the right candidate, one more example I can give you is, that one of the reasons for the stress in the infrastructure sector, which was part of the reason for the very bad situation we saw in the banks. Thankfully, we are now coming out of it due to a lot of hard work that we did in the last 3 or 5 years. But the infrastructure stress that happened was initially due to wrong selection. Not just that the promoters were wrong. In some cases, yes, that was the case. But in certain cases, the project itself was not viable and we were not able to take the right call. Then after you onboard, the second important stage is how your project is progressing. There are certain assumptions given based on which we lend or disburse money at various stages. Now, in order to be able to disburse the next installment, I am always looking for hard data, because if I get something wrong, the impact that will happen to the bank will come after a lag. So I will get to know when his cash flows start. If the project is already operational, then his cash flows will start driving. If it is at the conception stage, then it's even tougher because we don't even know. I'm not going to get any cash flows from him for quite some time. Now, is he a progress? So if he is at 90%, is he at 95% or is he at 75%? Very accurately, we need to know that. We always employ engineers and lenders engineers to do that work for us and to aid our own credit officers in doing that. But they would always benefit from any kind of additional inputs that they get at this stage, and especially in renewable energy. I think CPR's focus as well as Vasudha's foundation's focus is to enable India to in a calibrated manner move in this journey from the fossil fuel based kind of energy to renewable energy. But renewable energy, while we have a path, fairly well laid out path right now, there are, as Mr. Suni said, there are various challenges in that. Now, are we accomplishing those things at the right stage? And are we taking the right decisions? We need, sometimes the companies themselves, they are after all businessmen. They find a lot of value in that and they have invested money. But they also need guidance. Not everyone, they try to hire very good professionals to do it. But in the absence of correct data at each point in time, it would become difficult. And finally, of course, when we are monitoring a project, we need information. Suppose a project doesn't do well, or for whatever reason, at some point in time, it is stressed. I can take one example. In fact, it happened around COVID, after the break of COVID or just before that. So this is one of the large power plants. For obvious reasons, I'll not name it. It's a good power plant in terms of the viability and all is well established. They had some management issues for different reasons. And at that time, there was a monitoring team which was set up by the management itself. And we bankers were naturally concerned that in this time when there is some kind of management issue, we should make sure that the power plant continues to run well. And I think to their credit, they did a very good job of it. But at one point in time, and as you would know, in these large projects, there will be more than one bank. And it's a good thing. There are some banks, including SBI, but even others who do a lot of very in-depth research on what is impacting. So a power plant would ask the banks for some additional funds for whatever good reason. Now, at that point in time, this particular bank raised the issue on various aspects on the cost which they were incurring in their different units of the power plant located at different places. Now, then it boiled down to, and of course, these discussions normally had happened at the credit officers level, but this escalated to a point that I thought it was interesting enough and it was required of me to personally call a meeting, and we called all the senior bankers. And ultimately, it boiled down to an issue of data. So the manner in which that particular bank's credit officers had assessed that data had its own merits, but there was a counter view which the company had. And then, of course, as experienced people would do, we gave opportunity to both the sides and came up with a viable solution. So these divergences in your assumptions of what you take when you are actually estimating something is extremely important. And it's obvious, for obvious reasons, it is important to a banker or financer. And when you are doing monitoring, it's very, very important that as India goes ahead, you have seen the credit growth figures. one good thing that has happened to all the banks, at the end I'd say this, is that the corporate facing banks, an SBI or an ICICI or an Axis, or some of the other large public sector banks who were actually lending in the corporate market, what they have managed to do is they have managed to significantly clean up the stress, which is a humongous achievement because this has been done over a period of just 1 or 2 years, 2 or 3 years. And they have either, those assets have been either resolved, or even if they have not been resolved, they have been provided for, which is why you see that reflected in the results of the large banks which are now coming. But unfortunately, even today, we do not have credit growth. And credit growth will only come when the companies which require funding. So there are some, all the Sensex rise and all that you see are from blue chip companies who do not require cash at as much as some of the others who do. And the ones who require cash are either not being advanced cash because of risk mitigation measures by the banks themselves, and rightly so, because only when they are confident they will go ahead and disburse more, and or there is lack of demand. So that is the other side of data. And I think in the Vasudha presentation, it was there that, we are projected that we will be at 800 crores, whereas the actual demand will be some 800 gigawatt, whereas the actual demand will be somewhere around 300 gigawatt, if I remember that slide correctly. Now, these are kind of projections, these are kind of data which needs to be analyzed and brought forward to the people who are on the field. Our credit officers who are on the ground, the people in the power plants who are working on the ground, the people in the state electricity boards and who are actually dealing with these power companies on the ground, and so on and so forth. And there is no end to valuable coordination and cohesiveness in compiling data, which I think is what Vasudha is trying to do. And I would significantly urge that this be carried forward. It is something which is being liked by our project finance team from the time this was launched some time back. I did have the occasion of checking with them, and I'm sure it would be welcomed by many others. And policy advocacy firms like CPR should do much more in making data, as Mr. Soni was saying, very similar. So while we are federal, there are certain things which are federalism is fine. But when we are required to have a nationwide understanding of certain issues, and why should not we have similar formats or similar periodicity with which we have to release some data, whoever it might be, at that point. So thank you once again. It was I just shared some of the thoughts that came to me, and look forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basu. Now, may I request Urmi to provide her remarks?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so I will come at this question of data gaps in energy transition from a user's perspective, but a user who doesn't always require as much detailing, but more chewing done by those who provide the data than others do. So as a journalist, what do I need data for? If you're talking in terms of in the backdrop of energy transition, I need this data to understand the various pulls and pressures that are on in India's journey from fossil fuel centric nation to towards clean energy and eventual net zero. That is what I need to understand. I need to be able to when I'm writing, to be able to understand what is happening on the ground, why certain things can happen at speed and certain things cannot, and the data that is required for it. So for me, something like Vasudha's Power Info Hub is a brilliant sort of intervention. For the simple reason is that it makes my life so much simpler. I go to one site and I can get the information. I can get cross-sectoral information. I can get more detail than I could otherwise have done, because I would have spent time going to the CA website, to some other website, because the information is disparate. Now, the question is that there are, over the last few years, we have seen the rise of many efforts, many interventions. But as Mr. Soni did mention, and one pertinent point is that many of these are secondary, many of these sort of interventions deal with secondary data. So basically, they are taking data collected by some other place and putting it forward with their own analysis. Now that can become a bit of a problem, because then when I'm trying to say write, or anybody's trying to write, you then have to, in a sense, scrub out the analytics a little bit to see, okay, fine, is this, I'm trying to understand this. Say take the case of moving away from coal to a renewable centric energy system. So it depends on where the portal is in its sort of philosophy. You could find data being presented, because data in sometimes can be fungible, and therefore that becomes a bit of a problem. So that is one issue that is comes from the data in dealing with data. The other another issue that I seem to have when it comes to in terms of data gaps is when if we are limiting our discussion to just the electricity system, that's one thing. But the moment you're talking about energy transition, it's a bigger sort of a bigger pool. There is a lot of information that is not captured because it is just probably not possible. Like, how do you capture the data on people who use biomass, traditional biomass? I'm talking in terms of transition. Then how do you capture that data? So that becomes another what do you call like a blind spot in the data when for somebody who is trying to write on the issue. Of course, Srini mentioned it earlier, Mr. Basu, all the previous speakers actually have mentioned the issue of disparate data, disparate information. Very often you will find that for the same set of, the same, say, time period or the same set of parameters, the information is slightly different. Maybe because there is one minor parameter that's different, and that again presents a problem for me as an end user. So then the question is then is how much is the question of data gaps then boils down to two things. One is, does the data exist and is unavailable, or does the data exist and is unavailable? Now, on the latter, as we are saying, over a period of time, there has been a fair amount of improvement. Interventions like Vasudha Power and Pohab are actually even more useful because they tend to bring all the different issues together, which is critical when you're writing on the energy transition. Because at the end of the day, the energy transition is not just about electricity, but the larger field of energy usage. There are issues, and then to come back to the first part of it is that how do you get the information? How do we get information on data that is not accessible? As I mentioned in the say the traditional biomass use, is that if I'm writing on energy transition, isn't it important to be able to access some kind of even approximation of it? And that's a question I have, to Srini and the panel and all the other panelists, is how to address that, because we are talking of data gaps in the context of energy transition. There's another aspect that when it comes to data gaps that becomes critical again in the context of energy transition, and that is, how do we assess demand? I mean, after all, we are a country with growing needs. a lot of unmet needs. I mean, I think I was mentioning this to somebody, is that over the last few years, almost by by out of habit, you will see a lot of reports, including by me, which will mention something like 75% of our infrastructure is yet to be built. The truth is, the bulk of our infrastructure is yet to be built, but it's almost like we are stuck at a static figure. Is it possible to have places, information that allows me to update that number without me having to go down several rabbit holes? Because obviously I'm working to a deadline, and as would most journalists, short, long deadlines. But how do you address those data gaps? Now, why is it important that those data gaps get filled or represented in what we write? Because primarily that's one way of putting across information, of opinion building. A lot of times, a certain representation of how India is looking at transition comes from stuff we write. So it's critical that we are able to use that information. We are able to access that information. The last aspect that I would like to focus on in terms of a data gap is the need for granular data. Now, it is not every day that a journalist will say, a journalist who is based with a media outfit in Delhi will be writing about a district, say in Chhattisgarh. But it is possible to take possible perhaps at some point to write about these things, looking at not only in terms of district-wise granular data, but let's say plant-wise granular data, because it depends on what I'm looking at. And that absence of granularity often becomes a problem, because we need to accept that when in this journey of energy transition, there will be in not all states and union territories in India will be moving at the same pace, or can move at the same pace, or will actually have similar requirements. So if I'm writing on energy transition, for me to be able to present the best possible picture, I need the best possible information. And yes, if I have more time, I can go to various sources, but it would be so much better, and the output for most of the media work would improve drastically if access to data were easier to do, were easier, because it would mean that you would back up what you're writing based on data, which you did not have to spend whatever limited time you have chasing, and because that's your backup, that's buttressing what you're trying to say or what information you get. There was this point mentioned earlier about how often the media helps in bringing out data, but I think that's also, again, what we do is often take it from a source who may not be able to put it out there in the public or wants it to reach a wider public. So we become like the vessels or vehicle for transmission. It is not necessarily that we are actually mining that. Sometimes we do some data mining, but again, these are all ad hoc efforts that happen. Nothing systemic or systematic that's happening. So when it comes to, I think journalists would be able to tell a better story if we were able to access data without being conflicted on, I've got data out of CA, it says one thing, but if I go to the Ministry of Renewable Energy, it says something else. But if I go to the Ministry of Surface Transport, it says something else. And then trying to sort of get those data to speak to each other becomes like a fool's errand for somebody who is on a deadline. So for me, such interventions like the Vasudha Power Info Hub become saviors, literally. And hopefully, as such such portals become more granular and more detailed, and allow for more cross-sectoral sort of interventions, it'll make our work that much better. That's my hope. But of course, the question remains of data which you are not able to access in the first place. So then what happens? Because it's either not being counted or it is difficult to count. So that's a question I would want the panelists to respond to at some point, is that how do you account for that? Because that's also critical to the energy transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Surmi, for that interesting perspective. Thomas, now may I request you to provide your inputs?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ashwini. Good afternoon to everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces on the call. Thanks to CPR for the invitation. As mentioned in the introduction, I just completed 4 years at TERI and then moved to the International Energy Agency, where I work in the power sector modeling unit there. So I've been asked to speak about what are the data needs for power sector modeling specifically, which is a very data intensive activity. So let me preface the comments regarding data with a remark about what kind of questions are we trying to solve with power sector modeling. So typically, we're looking to answer questions related to, in the short term, how should the power system be operated on an hourly or sub-hourly basis in order to make sure that demand can meet supply. And in the medium to long term, medium means 5 years, 10 years, long term means 20, 30 years. What kind of capacity additions do we need in order to make sure that supply can meet growing demand? And the issue that we face is that with the emergence of variable renewables like wind and solar, whose output is both variable but also non-dispatchable, the answer to both of those questions now really becomes a question that you can only answer at the sub-daily level. Let me underline that again, sub-daily level. That means at least at the level of hours, if not at the level of 15 minutes or even 5 minutes. I'll give you an example. Srinivas put on the slide the projection for India's total installed capacity of about 800 gigawatt or a bit more by 2030, and total peak demand of a bit more than 300 gigawatt. So on the face of it, if you just took those two numbers, we would say, okay, we have a demand and supply gap, we will have excess capacity. But the real question is, what is the temporal coincidence of those two numbers? The 300 gigawatt of peak demand and the 800 gigawatt of supply. Because if more than half of those 800 gigawatt are wind and solar, they may not be available when you have 300 gigawatt of demand. And so the question is only answerable once we get down to the sub-annual level, certainly the sub-monthly level, and even the hourly level. So if we were to answer a question like, what kind of capacity additions does India need to put in place in the next 10 years? Then we have the question, what data do we need to answer that question through computer models? And are those data available? So let me list out 4 sets of data that we would need to start answering this question. The first one is the load profile data. In other words, what is the hourly shape of load in the system that you are trying to model, at least on a historical basis? Let me give you a couple of examples of what's so important and yet still difficult to obtain in India. During the Janta curfew last year, many people were concerned about the operation of the power system. They tried to answer the question before the curfew, how much would demand fall in those 10 minutes? Everyone made their own estimates, Pasokra made their estimate. I made my own estimate using TERI's demand model, and I can tell you that I was off by more than 100%. My estimate for how much demand would fall in those 10 minutes was half of how much it actually fell. And the reason it was so off is that we really have very little idea of what are the constituent elements of India's demand profile. What is the connected load of lighting? What is the connected load of industrial machines? What is the connected load of agricultural pumps? And so on. Let alone do we have long time series of publicly available data that allow us to get a sense of how the load profile is changing over time. Another example, before coronavirus hit in the beginning of 2020, it seemed that the Indian economy was recovering from whatever affected it at the end of 2019. That meant demand was falling between roughly October 2019 and January 2020. There was a significant collapse in electricity demand, but we still don't know what it was caused by. We don't know whether it was because of exceptional October monsoon rain, meant that agricultural pumping was less than usual. We don't know whether there was industrial bottlenecks, which meant that industrial production was less for these few months. We really have no idea what led to this quite substantial. It's not anecdotal. We're talking about monthly demand declines of 15, even 20% in October and November of 2019. We don't know what caused it. Or as India came out of the COVID-19 pandemic in January and February 2021, it seemed that we were hitting records of peak demand every day in those months. But if you actually look at the total demand that we hit in those days, the energy consumption on those days was far less relative to the relevant periods of 2020 or 2019 relative to the peak demand in those days. In other words, it seemed that India's demand was getting more peaky. We again don't know what is causing this. Is it a transitory phenomenon? Is it a permanent phenomenon? But this is critical to power sector planning. So load profile data, publicly accessible, at least at state level in time series is essential. Second item is transmission data. As the power sector transitions to higher shares of renewables, power transfers across states will be more and more important. So what are the current capacities of power transmission that we have in the country? What are their technical characteristics? What is the spatially disaggregated plan for the expansion of power transmission capacities? These are all critical information that the power sector modeler needs in order to build out a transmission system in the model that will allow power to be transferred, for example, from Tamil Nadu during the high wind months to the rest of the country, and vice versa during the low wind months or low solar hours of the day. The third item of power sector data that we need is production profiles for renewable energy at least hourly level. And they need also to be spatially disaggregated because we know that Tamil Nadu doesn't have the same wind regime as Rajasthan, for example, or Maharashtra. Right now, what modeling teams like the one I used to work in at Terry typically do is we use satellite reanalysis data to come up with estimates at hourly, spatially disaggregated level for insolation. And then from that, we try and calculate solar output for a given solar facility at any point in India in our model. Or we use satellite reanalysis data for wind speeds. We put that into a model that then generates wind output for a wind energy output for a particular turbine type, and that becomes the renewable resource for in our model. There are a couple of problems with this. How accurate is the satellite reanalysis data compared to actual dispatch on the ground? We are not so sure of that. How much data do we actually have? For example, most modeling teams use one representative wind year, typically 2014, because that is the year that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory of the United States did a lot of work to put together a very detailed satellite reanalysis year for 2014 wind output at any location in India. But how representative is 2014? We can get a sense of how important this is if we look at last year. Last year we had an exceptionally bad wind year wind power production was very low compared to the historical performance of recent years. It's a really relevant question for project developers and
Hello, Thomas, you have frozen. Hi, Thomas.
dropped off.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in any case, I was coming to a conclusion. There are just a few more comments that I wanted to make more briefly than the ones I just made. The first is regarding to data presentation. And I can tell you from someone that has worked a lot on data in India, often the biggest problem is not availability, it's presentation. And I think there is a legacy issue of a preference for human readable data formats versus machine readable. Humans like structured tables with, headers and columns that, give us a hierarchy of the data that is being presented. So we like Excels with merged headers. We like Excel tables with merged columns that, give us a hierarchy of what the elements are. But this is terrible for machine reading this data. Same goes for PDFs. So I think we have a real effort to make data available in more machine readable format. And this doesn't necessarily need to conflict with also presenting it in human readable format. If you want to put PDF tables available so that they can be looked at a glance, by all means put them in a human readable format. But if you want to make a large amount of data available to analysts so that they can answer important questions, I can tell you that if you keep putting data in that format, even if it's in Excel, if there are merged cells in Excel, it's a nightmare for reading in large amounts of data into a computer data memory. Then there's the question of accessibility. A lot of data are actually available, but the problem is getting to it. I'll give you one example. There's a lot of fantastic data about how centrally owned plants connected to the interstate transmission system are operated even at an hourly basis on the regional load dispatch centers. But if you want to get a long time series of this, you need to download multiple Excel files. I remember I wrote a computer program that was moving the mouse cursor around the screen just to select from drop-down menus every day that I wanted data and then downloading the Excel file, right? It would not be difficult just to make that available as a bulk download. Final comment that I wanted to make is, I think Mr. Soni gave us some very good comments about the importance of data policy. And I think there needs to be a real emphasis on the importance of policy and regulation to promote the availability, accessibility, and usability of data. So for example, a lot of data is already with the state load dispatch centers. If the CEA has the authority of, under the Electricity Act, of asking for data to be submitted, then we should have a regulation that makes that state center flow of data more smooth, more comprehensive, and more accessible also to the research community. So I'll stop there, Ashwini, and thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, very much for these insights. So let me start with you. The follow-up questions. So there's an audience question. What is required to make the data available? The kind of data you're talking about. And what is the cause of this data gap? Is it lack of finance, infrastructure, capacity, or we don't have a policy, which Mr. Soni and you mentioned, I mean, that mandates data availability? And second question I have is around the new IEA report, which you are a co-author of. So it sort of urges the countries to follow a 2050 deadline for net zero in energy sector. and we don't know whether India will follow that deadline or not. But given the availability of data available in India, and given your experience as a modeler working on India's energy system, do you think is it adequate enough to plan for next 3 decades? I mean, because we need much more granular milestones as well. So what we right now have is a target which is electricity specific and also supply specific. We don't have other targets, other milestones. How do we do that? And one point I wanted to mention, we are running out of time, so I request you to make it concise at 2 minutes. Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, so I think the audience question on accessibility, I did address in my comments. I think one of the main reasons for the lower data accessibility is simply one of capacity. I think in the central government institutions, there is a lot of demands on their time. Human resources for a dedicated data officer may not be there. And I think this is something where the civil society can also help in partnership. If we can devote resources as researchers to improving the presentation and accessibility of data that is already there, I think this would be a good thing. On the second question, regarding long-term energy systems modeling, I think we need to make a distinction between shorter-term or mid-term, and I'm using these terms sort of mean 2030 roughly, sectoral modeling, where the data requirement may be very high because you're looking at a very high degree of granularity in the recommendations and analysis that you need to do. And so there, the kind of data that I was talking about of hourly demand profiles, hourly renewable supply profiles are absolutely essential. I think when you get out into the longer term, 2050, the kind of policy questions that you're answering become a little less precise, and the type of modeling that you are able to do also becomes a little less precise, and the type of uncertainties that you face become higher. So for this kind of modeling, I think robust energy demand forecasting is essential. That's a key pillar, and I think more or less the data are there, although we can always improve upon it. And the other key part is technology cost data, because that's really what determines how the system might change in the long term. And there also, I think, there is data available typically at the international level or in other countries. I think one of the challenges faced is, how do you translate that technology cost data into Indian specific numbers? Sometimes, technology costs are cheaper in India, for example, solar PV. Sometimes they're more expensive. It's a little difficult to translate those global cost data into India specific cost data. But I would say that, the data requirements for long-term energy systems modeling are paradoxically actually a little bit less demanding than the data requirements for short-term or mid-term power sector modeling.
If I may add, if I could add to this very quickly, whether India, when India sets a net zero target of what year is eventually actually a very political decision. But the fact of the matter remains that is the direction of travel we have to move in. So whether it's 2050, 2060, 2070, that's a decision that has to be taken partly politically. Of course, it should be based on data. But I see that in this critical decade, it is probably important that we actually start creating institutions or accountabilities or footholds for data collection in a much more robust fashion. So let's say, as we all know, the National Electricity Plan. There is that exercise electricity policy that exercise is underway. Should have a collection of data, at least even in the electricity sector, and given that this transition will be about electrification of greater sectors of our economy, shouldn't this be one of the planks of that policy? So I think we need to look at the question of not just what gaps exist and what needs to be filled, but the institutional requirements so that those gaps are filled. And then whether you get civil society to be part of it or think tanks to be part of it in the presentation, those become a matter of detail. But I think once you create those requirements, I think very often we can then push on with more specific plans. Because let's face it, whichever way you look at it, data is critical to the transition process.
Thanks, Soumi. Now, can I get back to Mr. Sune? So Thomas pointed out that the data gap or the data limitations we have, it's largely capacity problem. So I wanted to ask for your perspective. Do you agree it's a capacity problem, or it's a technical challenge, or there are it's much more than that, like inertia to disclose information or political signals to not disclose information? That's one question, and I have a couple more questions. Let me put them together. So the other thing is the power sector particularly is going to not just a transition to cleaner energy sources, but simultaneously there's a push for greater market penetration in the sector as well. So given that, how do we navigate through this data challenge going forward? I mean, we certainly need a policy, but as someone from the audience has pointed out, probably the government or a CEA already know these challenges, and they know there is a need for a regulatory push for this, but why that is not happening? So how we can activate that? And I'll request you to stick to please 2 minutes so that we can wrap up on time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll have to just collate all what has been said, be it by Thomas or Urmi or everyone. So let me start one by one. That there is a need for a policy, I don't think there is any doubt about it. It can be only one line that this regulatory commission who should come out with a data policy, or CA should come out with a data policy. That must get inside NEP. But as a backup, what all we need to do, it's not a small subject. It's quite a complex subject. And as I said, the more I get into tar pit, I find that I have just scratched the surface. So along with that, we will need IT infrastructure. We'll need designations like data scientist, data warehousing. It's not a small job. It's we have storehouse and storekeeper assistant, but not data storekeeper and data cleaners and data managers. We need all of them. That's one part. The other thing I would say that please have a look at the 2 long documents, one by DST, another by METI. Both are available in public domain. I can send the link, but you can search it. And they are quite an extensive documents. They quote all the legal aspect and very nice documents to read with. But that's at a much larger scale. Coming to power system, please have a look at the report named Kabil. You were asking about capacity. Yes, that Kabil, it's an acronym. It's a capacity building of Indian load dispatchers. There is a full chapter on data, that how the data should be collected, how should it be kept, how it should be disseminated, how should it be, analytics should be developed, because this problem is going to become much, much more acute in future. If for a country like India, we have to put in huge amount of effort. And this realization has to come from the policy side. And it's not a very easy job. It's going to take a lot of time. First to have the policy pronouncement, get the regulations made, then provide all kinds of IT infrastructure, and then capacity building, and so on and on. But it's doable. It is doable, and it can be done, provided we have in the policy, we have the detailed documents, which are more or less available, and then create an IT infrastructure at every place. See, interoperability itself is an issue. We as a system operator, we face a lot of issues. How do we have interoperability? Machine readable versus human readable. Within 1 minute, we have to run a security constraint economic dispatch. How do we interchange all the data? There are a huge number of challenges, And this should be the way. And coming to the platforms of visualization and display, let me say that that's a much smaller thing. That's not a very big thing, because there are a lot of tools available one can do. First, let's set right what all data has to be collected, who will collect it, how we will store it, how will it disseminate it, and how will it clean it. And then, of course, allow many people to do creative work on those data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sun. Mr. Basu, you shared us an interesting perspective from the finance sector. So I had a follow-up question on that. So we often hear claims that the past power sector financing, particularly to the generators, has suffered because of data gaps, because the banks didn't have adequate information to make right kind of information. So, but going forward, we are sort of going to have a different system with RE particularly, where we have a shorter gestation period and there are much more players as opposed to the old hydro and thermal system. So does it require a different set of information sharing and negotiation between the investors and the developers? How do you see, if we are going to add so much RE capacity, how that has to change going forward?
Right. So you're absolutely right. So first comment is that data, of course, is extremely important. And even with the availability of, say, real-time data and, giving the whole picture, there could be some issues relating to viability. As you would know that even within renewable, there has been a change. So we have also in the banks become more seasoned based on our experience over the last 10 or 15 years. And the policy that, in fact, earlier we used to have one omnibus policy for the entire power sector and, try and, in the various types of energy, renewable energy having. But now we have a different policy for wind, a different policy for solar. And as you would be aware that even in wind energy, there have been experiences which have not gone well, even with companies which initially showed a lot of promise. So typically one thing as an example I can take is that this thing about the price coming down, which is a good thing. But to what extent it is actually makes the project viable, and beyond which it goes, it's no longer viable. So again, data is a very important element of determining that, because unless you have accurate data. But I think, long-term viability of projects have to be conceived in the manner which is again holistic. So what does a solar power project? I think the current focus is in renewables is primarily on solar, and I would say going forward a mix of solar with wind, in case storage is possible. I think these are very early days. But whether those projects are viable, at the end of the day, it's apart from a bank adding an NPA and having to take haircuts, any episode which is long lasting makes the entire lending habit become circumspect, as has happened with banks. So we would like to avoid that as we go forward. The good news is that the project pipeline, SBI is the largest infrastructure financer and in the power sector. There is a project pipeline. We have been supporting solar and wind energy projects, wind to a lesser extent now. And I think, but we need more and more banks to come on board. So the calculation that I had is at the pace that we are going, we would suppose this were not to get enhanced. Then as against the 111 lakh crore, which is what the government has envisaged over the next 5 years, we would be somewhere at around 70 or 75 lakh crores. So one good thing, of course, is now that this DFI is coming up, the new DFI, which is being reinstalled. So hopefully they would come with a model both for their capital requirements as also their ability to lend, which would be a good support to the commercial bank. And basically, the other thing which banks look at is their ability to get projects refinanced quickly. So basically, you would be aware that banks always could face a asset liability mismatch, because our liabilities, that is our deposits, etc., are always more short term than what we are required to lend for the infrastructure sector. So these issues need to be addressed, and data is definitely one of the clean data, accurate data, transparent data, and timely data, I think, are very important for making judicious decisions. But it will be one component.
Thank you, Mr. Vasu. So we are already 1 minute over the time, but I'll take 2-3 minutes more and request Srini to make any last remarks before we close.
Thank you, Ashwini. I just wanted to add here that I completely agree with the comments that have been made by all the panelists. And our endeavor would be to help and provide or make accessible the kind of data that would be required, particularly from an energy transition point of view. Thomas, your points are well noted, and we are actually exploring the possibility of in the phase 2, we are putting together a whole lot of demand side data, and that should be out in about a month's time maximum. It's the data is all compiled and collated, and it's now being put together by the web developer. We are also aiming to look at hourly demand data and from consumer category hourly demand data. That, of course, is not very easily available, but we're trying to see where we can. And our endeavor would be to see that we are able to put together or make this a comprehensive website. And going forward in the phase 3, we're also looking at adding key economic indicators to this, so that it becomes a one-stop shop for energy and climate modelers to sort of access the data from without any cost, without and nothing hidden behind paywalls. I'll stop here for now.
Thanks, Srini. So this has been very fascinating and informing discussion. So thank you very much, all the panelists, for giving your time. So few things we take from here is data is important to plan for our energy trajectory, and we certainly need a policy push or regulatory push to get that done. And we need a clear outline of how do we manage that. And those are key common things coming out of this discussion. And with this, I thank everyone for your time, and thanks for staying in presence. And thank you very much. We'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.